Since Tea Party Catholic appeared a little more than a month ago, it too has caused quite a stir. We've had a lot of reviews. Commentary writers are referencing it in the arguments that Sam makes in there. He's been on radio at least 30 or 35 times, and this continues to roll. The book has sold out at least twice on Amazon, which has forced them to scramble to keep it in stock, and I'm sure it is deservedly heading for more printings. A little bit about our speaker today. Dr. Samuel Gregg is Research Director at the Acton Institute and author of many books, including the two I just mentioned most recently. He has written and spoken extensively on questions of political economy, economic history, Catholicism, and natural law theory. He has an MA from the University of Melbourne and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in moral philosophy and political economy from the University of Oxford. He's the author of several books, including Economic Thinking for the Theologically Minded, 2001, On Ordered Liberty, 2003, his prize-winning The Commercial Society, 2007, The Modern Papacy, 2009, and Becoming Europe earlier this year. He's also written a academic press book on the economist Wilhelm Röpke, which deserves a wider audience, I think. So 2 books this year. Sam, we have a couple months left, so in case you can crank out another one for us there. One of the things Sam will do today is explain why the new book is titled, and brilliantly I think, Tea Party Catholic, and he'll also unpack the subtitle here, A Catholic Case for Limited Government, a Free Economy, and Human Flourishing. In doing so, he'll point in a positive fashion how we go about the process of renewal, social, political, cultural, firmly rooted on principle. And on matters of principle, I don't think we could find a more compelling and important figure than the American founder Charles Carroll, who to the end of his life never ceased to commend the U.S. Constitution to contemporaries and future generations as, I quote, the best earthly inheritance, end quote, that our ancestors could bequeath to us. I'm grateful to Sam for bringing Carroll to the fore and educating me, and I'm sure many others, on this founder's significance, and I suspect that Carroll's relative state of obscurity on matters historical and constitutional is probably now over, due in large part to this book. So at this point, I'd like to ask Sam to come on up here, and we shall get started.
Thank you. Thanks, Gregg. Oh, thank you, John, for your very kind introduction. It's a great privilege for me to be speaking to you all today, especially those of you who are students or who are in some way new to the work of the Acton Institute. As I think most of you know, Acton, of course, is an ecumenical, even interfaith organization, and our focus is truly international. In fact, a very large percentage of our work occurs outside the United States today. But as an American-based institute, we've always sought to engage with thinkers and figures associated with the American experiment and to draw parallels between aspects of that experiment and, of course, Christianity, including Catholic Christianity. It's also, I should mention, a connection that's been made by no less than the 2 previous occupants of the chair of Peter, Blessed John Paul II and Benedict XVI, as both of them have drawn quite explicit parallels between the claims made by America's founders on the one hand and those of the Catholic Church on the other. Now, as I think many people know, some of these parallels have been disputed and even critiqued by some Catholics who regard the American experiment as far too deeply immersed in Enlightenment thought to be reconcilable with Catholic belief. Now, that said, I suspect you won't be surprised to learn that my book, Tea Party Catholic, disputes that particular contention. Instead, it argues that the American experiment, which, like any other human creation, is not perfect, it is nonetheless something from which Catholics can learn, and which Catholics can, if they choose, shape in ways that promote what I and many other people at Acton describe as human flourishing. And in our time, I think that's especially important because I think that it's a distinct contribution that Catholics in America can bring to the much-needed renewal that's desperately required throughout America of the movement for limited government and a free economy. In other words, they can bring a deeper, more coherent comprehension of why freedom really matters, including in the economy. So, to that end, Tea Party Catholic spends much time explaining the following 6 points. First of all, it argues that entrepreneurship, economic liberty, and the market are not simply just more efficient than the alternatives, they also create tremendous opportunities for what the Church calls integral human development. Second, I suggest that a highly economically interventionist state isn't just economically ineffective, but I go on and argue that it actually undermines human flourishing. Third, the book maintains that there are better, more holistic ways for Americans to realize their obligations to those people in need than looking to large welfare states. Fourth, the book suggests that a robust conception of religious liberty is essential for human flourishing and for limiting government power, including, as I'll illustrate, in economic life. Fifthly, Tea Party Catholic maintains that the market economy and the ideal of limited government is far more dependent upon a strong civil society, intact families, and a robust moral culture than many people realize. And sixth and lastly, Tea Party Catholic tries to address some of the critiques that are often made by some Catholics and others of the market economy and of the idea of limited government. What about social justice? What about the option for the poor? What about trade unions? What about consumerism? Now, these are all legitimate questions, and Tea Party Catholic tries to provide a response. Now, unpacking all of these points is not going to be my purpose today, although it might be a good reason for you to go and buy the book afterwards. But in any event, in our limited time today, what I'd like to do is focus on three things. The first is to say something about the book's title. The second is to outline some of the thinking about why I wrote this book at this particular time. And the third thing about which I'm going to talk, and which you'll be hearing a lot more from Acton over the next 3 years, is the book's treatment of the theme of religious liberty, and more specifically how erosions of economic freedom have significant implications for what Americans have long called the first freedom. So, let me begin by posing the question, why Tea Party Catholic? More than one person has said to me, well, that's a little provocative. And the same individuals are usually surprised when I tell them that the book itself basically has very little to do with the Tea Party movement today itself, which incidentally, by the way, turns out, according to very recent studies, to consist of overwhelmingly socially conservative, pro-life, middle class, mostly Christian, family-orientated individuals with above-average educational qualifications, rather than the wild-eyed nihilists of Harry Reid's imagination. Now, of course, like most books, there's more than one reason why the title was chosen. One is something that publishers and marketers understand much better than scholars. That if you want people to read your book, you need to get their attention. And a title like Tea Party Catholic certainly has managed to do that. But there's two other reasons for the title. One reason, it seems to me, for the contemporary Tea Party movement's success in quickly attracting support from millions of Americans was surely its name. It resonates, I think, with Americans because it harks back to the American founding and the American Revolution that gave birth to a bold and thus far lasting experiment in human freedom. So in one sense, the Tea Party movement's emergence emergence is proof, I think, as the Jesuit theologian John Courtney Murray often said, it's proof that America is a propositional nation. Now, by that, Murray meant that America had the unique capacity to renew itself by going back to the moral, cultural, and political founding on which it began, much as the Catholic Church renews its teaching by returning to the sources of that teaching and then bringing those truths to bear upon contemporary questions. So it's in this light and in this spirit that Tea Party Catholic tries to show how Catholic Americans can contribute to the renewal of the United States through the way they understand the American founding. And to that end, the book tries to draw out of Catholic thought some fresh ways of thinking about the American experiment, especially in light of some of America's current debates, many of which have to do, as we all know, with the economy and the role of government. Now, in that regard, as readers of my book soon discover, and as John alluded to, I think that the life and the thought of the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, Charles Carroll of Carrollton, has a significant role to play in a Catholic reimagining of the American experiment. I have to say that encountering Charles Carroll's life and reading his correspondence and writings was for me a revelation and a delight. I have to say it still surprises me that even today, even many well-informed Catholic Americans know relatively little, if anything, about this Catholic founder. Most people, of course, remember Carroll today as the last signer who died, as well as the individual who was the wealthiest man in the colonies at the time of the American Revolution. But in Tea Party Catholic, I argue that for Catholic Americans who believe in limited government, in religious liberty, and a free economy, and who want to ground these things on a robust conception of human flourishing, that Charles Carroll is an indispensable reference point. Apart from being, perhaps alongside John Witherspoon, probably the best educated of all the founders, Charles Carroll was an immensely successful entrepreneur. He was a member of several legislatures. He was a genuine expert on finance and economics. He was a staunch ally and defender of General Washington during the Revolutionary War. He was a hugely important figure on the Continental Congress's Board of War. He was a profound thinker, as his writings and correspondence illustrate, and he was a relentless fighter for religious liberty. So in many respects, I think Charles Carroll has a genuine claim to being the first Tea Party Catholic. The second reason for the book's title is to be found in the subtitle, which is The Catholic Case for Limited Government, Free Economy, and Human Flourishing. Now, I chose these words very carefully. The phrase limited government does not mean that one is necessarily opposed to government per se. Rather, to be in favor of limited government and to be dubious about extensive government economic intervention simply involves arguing on grounds of principle and prudence that government should normally have a rather small number of well-defined roles that are limited in their scope, including with regard to the economy. Now, such an ideal, I think, has been core to the entire Western tradition from its very beginning. It's also been core, I think, to the American experiment. But these are ideas that also stand, I think, just like the Catholic Church, at the very center of Western civilization. Likewise, I chose the expression free economy because I think it conveys many normative messages about that, frankly, words like capitalism and market economy really don't. Because at the market economy's core is much more than just the rule of law, stable money, free association, free trade, and all these other good things. What is, in fact, crucial is freedom. And without a substantial degree of freedom, there is no market economy. Now, this emphasis upon freedom on the part of what might be called limited government Catholics or free enterprise Catholics is one reason that some of their critics have claimed that they sup at the table of people like the pro-capitalist but militantly atheist Ayn Rand. Now, you won't be surprised to know that I think that such assertions are unfounded, not particularly well thought out, but nonetheless require rebuttal. Hence, much of Tea Party Catholic argues that a Catholic case for limited government and the free economy is quite different from the arguments made in favor of the same things by people from other schools of thought. And I think the key difference in play that Catholics can bring to the American experiment in liberty is something that is regarded as metaphysical daydreaming by other people. And this is the rich conception of human flourishing. This is an idea that's at the core of the Catholic Church's commitment to religious liberty, as spelled out in the Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Freedom, Dignitatis Humanae. But my book argues that the idea of human flourishing is quite applicable to the development of a morally thick case for the free economy and for limiting government's economic role. And herein lies an important reason why I wanted to outline an explicitly Catholic case for the realization of these ends. Many people today who favor free enterprise, they tend to argue in terms of freedom being preferable to servitude, or that the free economy, for all its weaknesses, is less bad than social democracy. Now, critiques of modern liberal and social democratic economic arguments, I think, are very important. But criticism has its limits, not least among which are rhetorical. Many people who favor free markets and limited government often turn out to be rather better at arguing what they're against rather than what they're for. And one major criticism, I think, a legitimate one, of those free marketers who took issue with John Maynard Keynes in the 1930s is that they focused primarily on discrediting his ideas for escaping the Great Depression instead of combining that critique with positive proposals for genuine change. So I think that Catholics who favor limited government and the free economy, they have to avoid this error. Catholic critiques of interventionist policies are very important, but critiques by themselves simply aren't enough. Hence, my book tries to show that those Catholics, those who favor limited government and the free economy, that their positive case for these types of things has to go far beyond arguments like, well, it creates more space for us to allow us to do whatever we happen to want to do. In fact, the Catholic argument is not autonomy for the sake of autonomy. It's not liberty for the sake of liberty. Rather, it regards the goal of liberty to be human flourishing. The excellence that every person can realize through the reasonable use of their freedom. An excellence that's rooted in our very nature as people who are called to embrace all those goods that make us flourish precisely as human beings rather than embrace mediocrity. And that, Tea Party Catholic argues, is what the happiness in the phrase life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness needs to be about. And this, by the way, is not just for the sake of American Catholics. Over the past 40 years, I think it's hard to dispute that the incomprehension with which many Catholics in Western Europe, Latin America, Africa, and Asia, the incomprehension with which they view many American Catholics' attachment to economic liberty and limited government has remained. In fact, I think it's even grown. Because despite what might be called some of the American insights of encyclicals like Blessed John Paul II's Centesimus Annus, or even part of Benedict XVI's Deus Caritas Est, many Catholic Americans' more skeptical views of extensive government intervention continue, and I can attest to this personally, they continue to be considered odd, even a little suspect, by many Catholics outside the United States, including many who are quite orthodox on questions of faith and morals. So Tea Party Catholic, in one sense, tries to help these audiences understand the roots of many Catholic Americans' views on these matters and how they represent a legitimate prudential application of Catholic thinking about liberty, government, and the economy. So let me move to the second part of my comments, which is to ask, why now? Why write such a book now? After all, some people might say, hasn't all this work already been done? People like Michael Novak in the 1980s and 1990s, they performed yeoman's work in presenting Catholic defenses of the market economy. And I must add that people like Michael Novak, like Father Sirico, they did so at a time when writing such works was to risk alienating oneself permanently from many of those people who belonged to that immediate post-Vatican II generation of American Catholics that were trending leftwards on political and economic subjects. But since that time, I think there's been many developments which indicate that many of these specifically Catholic arguments require elaboration and sharpening. In the first place, by any objective measure, government interventionism has expanded in the United States over the past 80 years, and America continues to slip behind other nations when it comes to key indicators of economic freedom. That, I think, we know. We see the evidence all around us. But in the second place, I think we've also seen some specific economic problems emerge upon which there has been relatively little Catholic reflection in recent decades. A very good example of this is the size and growth of our national debt. So to that end, Tea Party Catholic tries to look at some of those particular questions and provide some answers. A third and more happy development, I think, has been the considerable growth in Catholic reflection on the nature of freedom and human flourishing since the 1980s. I think this was perhaps most powerfully outlined in John Paul II's 1993 encyclical Veritatis Splendor. But surprisingly little of these reflections have been applied to thinking about the economic realm, which is odd, I think, given the sheer number of Catholics working today in the world of business. On Wall Street, for example, Wall Street is no longer dominated by Episcopalians and Jews. The biggest demographic group, religiously speaking, on Wall Street today are Roman Catholics. So again, Tea Party Catholic tries to apply some of these reflections upon freedom to the realm of the economy. Fourthly, Benedict XVI, when he was Pope, I think he took Catholic social teaching in some new directions. And in all his encyclicals, Benedict articulated insights with significant implications, I think, ranging from how we understand the government's economic role to the hows and whys of helping our neighbor in the context of a market economy. Now, I think many of these insights, as I argue in the book, are very important when it comes to the modern Catholic case for economic liberty and limited government. And lastly, in March 2013, the world witnessed the election of the first Pope from the Americas. Now, the elevation of Argentina's Jorge Bergoglio reflects many things, including the fact that a plurality of the world's Catholics now live in the New World. And the history of Latin America is, of course, intimately tied to that of the United States, and today it's especially reflected in the millions of Catholics who have migrated from Latin America to reside in the United States. And many of them have come to the United States because they have endured severe poverty and lacked economic opportunity in freedom more generally in the lands of their birth. Now, I think from the very beginning of Pope Francis's ministry, it's been very clear that he's going to use his office to remind Catholics of the concrete obligations that they have to those people in poverty. Now, concern for the poor has always been central to the Church's message, and it's always been talked about by all the popes from time immemorial. But Pope Francis's attention to this subject and the fact that he comes from a region of the globe in which poverty is in some places endemic, it means that Catholics, including people like me who favor economic freedom and limited government, we have to think more carefully about how our prudential application of Catholic thinking to economic subjects can help alleviate the poverty of the least among us. So these are all developments the Tea Party Catholic tries to address. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned the religious liberty question. And in Tea Party Catholic, I devote a whole chapter to this particular subject. Of course, there's no shortage of Americans writing about the subject of religious liberty today. But one question some people have asked me is, what does religious freedom have to do in a book that's essentially about economic liberty and limited government? Well, the answer is twofold. First, without a robust conception of religious liberty, the ideal of limited government is very, very hard to sustain. The second is that the substantive corrosion of economic freedom that occurs when the state begins pursuing a highly interventionist economic agenda can have very negative implications for religious freedom. Now, for some people, this isn't so obvious, so let me explain why. Part of it has to do with the mutually reinforcing character of different expressions of freedom. Religious intolerance, for instance, has always been one basis for targeting the economic freedom and poverty of other people. Now, this was well understood by Charles Carroll. He often said, an economic motive for religious intolerance. He said this, quote, "Selfish men invented the religious tests to exclude from posts of profit and trust their weaker or more conscientious subjects," end quote. Charles Carroll was also very conscious that his family's tremendous economic success created an economic incentive for private individuals to collude with government officials to invoke the anti-Catholic laws against him, his family, and other Catholics in order to limit their ability to compete in the marketplace, or, more simply, just to confiscate their wealth outright. In other words, laws that unjustly restrained people's religious freedom turned out to be a way of undermining their economic independence. Now, a more modern connection between religious liberty on the one hand and economic freedom on the other is the way that the contemporary welfare state's growth is now helping to undermine the freedom of Catholics and Catholic organizations in America who want to adhere to their church's moral teachings. Now, such questions, I think we all know, were initially brought into sharp focus by the Obama administration's Health and Human Services mandate concerning the provision of healthcare insurance. But, as explained by the distinguished Catholic historian James Hitchcock, quote, "Less obvious is the fact that such infringements, and many that will be far worse, are endemic to the modern welfare state and were bound to emerge sooner or later," end quote. Why? Well, because, as Hitchcock observes, the modern American welfare and regulatory state is now thoroughly imbued with thoroughly secularist assumptions about the human person. Why else, for example, would some people insist that access to abortion-inducing drugs is somehow a human right that the state has to provide? Why else would those who seek to expand access to healthcare through government fiat, why are they so apparently willing to effectively require people who regard certain actions as intrinsically evil to violate their consciences by cooperating in such acts? All these matters, I'd argue, should be leading more and more Catholics to ask themselves, and our bishops, frankly, some very serious questions about what government funding of Catholic organizations has done and is doing to the culture of Catholic organizations today. Because if the secularist vision of freedom is one of progressive liberation through state action, from what secularists typically regard as irrational constraints, such as the Catholic conception of morality, if that's true, then it frankly makes no sense for governments who are committed to a secularist view of the person to exempt religious organizations from conforming to secularist expectations when it comes to providing something like healthcare insurance. Because for secularists, frankly, religious liberty is at best, a third or fourth level concern compared to the specific rights associated with modern secularism, many of which they believe can and must be secured through the modern welfare state. And this brings me to where I'd like to conclude my remarks. One of the things I realized in the process of writing Tea Party Catholic is the way that Catholicism sheds a particular light on America and on the state of the American experiment that few other traditions can rival. Now, initially that might seem like an odd claim. After all but one of the American signers of the Declaration of Independence were Protestants, albeit with different levels of commitment to their respective confessions. And some of them we know were far removed indeed in their personal theological beliefs from the God revealed in Scripture and ultimately in the person of Christ. Nonetheless, Tea Party Catholic wants to suggest that the Catholic vision of freedom is not utterly incompatible with the understanding of the nature and ends of liberty that was articulated by many of America's founders. In the first place, the founders, as many of us know, appealed to God and to providence over and over and over again. Now, in the case of someone like Thomas Jefferson, these references, I think, should certainly be read as reflecting the positions of someone who's essentially inclined to a deistic position. Yet, words like God, words like providence, also imply that there is purpose and there is design in creation, including in human beings, human reason, and in human liberty itself. Now, that alone, I think, provides something of a starting point for a genuine conversation between Catholicism on the one hand and many of the ideas expressed in the American founding on the other. And I think it's a conversation that more than ever seems necessary to me. America and the American founding are not, of course, heaven on earth. Likewise, Charles Carroll's Catholicism meant that his vision of human liberty was never going to be precisely the same as that of a deist like Benjamin Franklin or even a Presbyterian like John Witherspoon. But what the Catholic could share with the deist and with the Protestant Presbyterian was a notion of freedom as liberty as self-government. Indeed, however debauched some of the founders' lives may have been, it's very hard to find eulogies to hedonism in the founders' writings, let alone efforts to radically cordon off the truth known by reason and the claims that that makes upon human freedom. And for many of the founders, reason itself suggested that freedom found its apex in the cultivation of virtue. I don't think that anyone can seriously doubt that most of the founders would have regarded modern hedonistic accounts of liberty as not only intellectually shallow, but also deeply corrosive of a society's capacity to remain free. Inspired in many cases by reflection on the writings of Romans such as Cicero and 18th century philosophers such as Montesquieu, the founders spoke of virtues such as honesty and trust and industriousness, but they also spoke of marriage and religion. Now, this doesn't mean that government and law have no role whatsoever in shaping the moral culture of free societies. The founders never imagined that law could somehow be neutral or somehow purely procedural. But a key insight of figures such as Washington, of Jefferson, of Adams, of Madison, and Charles Carroll was that if we are not willing to govern our free choices from within, then we should not be surprised if governments attempt to direct our choices from without, to the point whereby freedom itself gradually fades from our horizon, and along with it, our opportunities to partake of human flourishing. Now, understood in this way, this ideal of liberty as self-government, it mitigates not just against self-enclosed individualism, but also against forced communalization from above. Now, Charles Carroll understood this point extremely well. Commenting upon the proposed federal constitution, Carroll warned that once virtue ceases to prevail, either as a reality or as an ideal in a free society, then he said the laws would become, quote, dead letters, their spirit and tendency being inconsistent with the general habits of such a people, end quote. Moreover, Carroll went on to add, the potential for despotism in these type of circumstances starts to become very real. Quote, he said, such has been the destiny of every people who once free, but who knew not how to enjoy the blessings of freedom, who suffering their liberty to become licentiousness, passed laws subversive of every principle of law to glut their resentments and avarice, end quote. Sound familiar? Now, I know some Catholics have expressed reservations about drawing too close a parallel between the Catholic vision of freedom and virtue with that of the founders. And the correlation is indeed very far from being exact. Very few founders used particular expressions that you find in the writings of people like Thomas Aquinas. In particular cases, the founders' understanding of natural law seemed to owe more to John Locke than to the classical traditions of natural law. And while many of the overwhelmingly Protestant American colonists spoke of the New World in explicitly religious terms, their words weren't precisely akin to Vatican II's particular description of the relationship between this world and the kingdom that is to come. Nonetheless, an underlying theme of Tea Party Catholic is that there is enough in the American founding for those Catholic Americans who believe that liberty is orientated to truth and that true life is found by freely living in the truth to continue to make their place here in the United States. Now, granted, this may mean that those Catholic Americans who favor the free economy, who support limited government, and who insist upon a robust conception of the First Amendment are increasingly going to find themselves more at odds with those who are pursuing a rather different vision of the United States. But, as Tea Party Catholic holds, I believe such Catholics can show their fellow Americans that they're not just faithfully Catholic, but they're also being faithful to the founding. And in that sense, I believe such Catholics can help to transform the wider movement in America to reground the United States upon the best insights of the American experiment and thereby help, I think, to save that experiment itself. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. We've built into the program, if you take a look at your program, we've built in ample time really for questions and some answers. So I think we can go to 1:15. So if you have a question for Dr. Gregg, just raise your hand. I'll get to you. And then try to speak right into the mic as we're recording this today. So
I think I'll phrase it this way. The culture today tends to disregard anything older than perhaps 30 years as less relevant. And so going all the way back to the founding of the country and the Constitution seems likewise less relevant to most of the people here. So the argument about maintaining the integrity of the Constitution and its values holds less water. Could you speak to that a little bit,
Sure.
please?
When I did first year philosophy, I was told that real legal thinking began when John Rawls wrote his Theory of Justice in 1971, and everything else. We weren't taught anything about before that. We literally weren't taught anything before that. So I think it's true to say that knowledge of the founding, knowledge of the American experiment, knowledge of the Constitution, knowledge of the tradition from which all those things have emerged is considerably less than it was maybe 20, 30, 40, even 50 years ago. It's interesting, for example, that when you hear many people who describe themselves as progressives, when they start talking about their ideas, have you noticed they never reference the American founding? Never reference the American founding. They never reference particular figures. They engage, if they do, it's usually to engage in selective citation of figures like Jefferson and his comments about a wall of separation, etc., etc. So I think, in one sense, what you're reflecting, what you're saying is true. There is this widespread ignorance, sometimes disinterest, and frankly, in some instances, a lot of hostility towards the American founding and the American experiment. None of that, however, is not a reason to go back and to say, well, maybe it's not a bad idea to understand where these ideas that have shaped America, where some of these ideas that are very important, that shape our lives in ways that we don't even often realize, where they came from, why they were important, and why they are significant. Because in the sense you could say, well, that's not relevant. Well, the point is I think we need to make them relevant again. That's the point. And the reason I think you can make them relevant is because I think it reflects the American experiment, the American founding, reflects in its best parts some of the great insights of the Western tradition, of Western civilization, of which I think we are part of and which we shouldn't be ashamed of talking about more and explaining to people. So it's really a question, I think, of going back in order to bring these ideas to the present and to say maybe these things have some relevance to the way that we think about contemporary problems today. And I do think that John Courtney Murray's comment about America being a propositional nation is very important, that America does have these reference points in a way that a lot of other countries don't. And it's a good way of looking at ourselves and saying, okay, are we being faithful to the founding, or are we not? Have we departed from it? And if so, how have we done so? And do we want to depart from it?
Following what the gentleman said here is, who cares? We look at Europe, and golly, they have all these wonderful places that we want to go to, et cetera, et cetera. So why worry about a bunch of old European dead white guys? And so the argument there is no matter how well, and you did a great job, but the end result is what's wrong with European governments, et cetera? Thank you.
Well, if you want to know the answer to that question, there's a book over there called Becoming Europe, which goes into that in enormous detail. Well, where does one even start? In the case of what you see happening in Europe, what I do see, what I do argue in that particular book, is that you do have a type of cultural transformation that's been actually going on for a very long time. It's not something that's just happened in the last 40 years. It's something that's traceable back to the French Revolution, but even further beyond that, to even some medieval ideas about the good society and the nature of government. But as I say in the Becoming Europe book, one of the things that America has as an advantage is that we can look to Europe and say, well, European countries come from more or less the same foundation, they're shaped more or less by the same cultural influences, and yet they seem to be going in a very different direction. Europe used to be the continent, remember, in 1914, that literally ruled the world. Now, at least in terms of, for example, the global economy, its size of the global economy is shrinking, its proportion of the global population is in free fall. It's very clear that many Europeans don't care about the past. They don't care about the future either, by the way. It's another problem. That's why they're not, one of the reasons they're not having children. And they seem quite content to settle for what Alexis de Tocqueville described as soft despotism, which is a type of self-imposed slavery whereby we vote for those people who promise to give us what we want as long as we keep voting for them. So, why should we know about Europe? Well, because in some respects, America is heading in the same direction. And some parts of the country are already there. California, I'd suggest, is already there. Chicago is already there. Detroit was there several years ago. So if one is interested, if one cares about one's country, and I talk about what patriotism means, by the way, in the book Tea Party Catholic and why it's important today. If one cares about one's country, if one cares about the type of country that one's children is going to grow up in, and if one cares that 200 and more years ago some people made some incredible sacrifices because they thought that freedom was worth fighting for, then that's a good reason to know more about these people, to know more about why Europe has ended up in its current position, and also how America can avoid going down the same path. And I think that America, as I said before, has an enormous advantage in the sense that it can go back to the founding and ask itself some very hard questions. And at times of American history, Americans have done that. There is a genuine question, though, and from the last two questions, I take it that this is the point, how much some Americans actually care about this at all. Now, I think maybe there are some that just don't care. They'd rather live in a world populated and created by John Rawls. They'd rather live in a world in which freedom seems to be reduced to satisfying my emotions and desires, and I don't care how that happens, and it's even preferable if someone else pays for it. All that said, I think that at least in America, there are enough Americans who do care about that, who do want to go in a different direction, and who see that direction as quite consistent with what the founders of this country intended for it in the first place.
Yes.
You alluded to the fact that I think Catholic Social Services or something like that may need to rethink its attachment to funds from the government. Is the argument you're making entering the realm of discussion within Catholic Social Services, and is your argument making some headway with that choice? The last time I looked, the federal government gave more to Catholic social service than any other religious charity. So, and most of the large religious charities depend upon government funding. But my question is, that argument you're making, is it making inroads into Catholic charities?
Certainly making inroads into the Catholic Church. When you discover that Catholic charities, for example, something like 72% of its funding comes through government contracts. And that raises questions about who are they working for? Are they working for the church? Do they have the concerns of the poor and the marginalized and the needy in mind? Or are they more concerned about how do I get that next contract so that I can pay the people who work for me, also that we can go about doing things in a particular way? Because one of the problems of accepting state funding, be it in the form of contracts or in more direct forms of funding, I think, is that it starts to subtly corrode the autonomy and independence of the religious organization. It starts to mean that the organization ceases to focus upon what it thinks should be the priorities because it's forever trying to get that contract. I also think, and I talk a lot about this in Tea Party Catholic, it tends to mean that the organization itself, its distinctly religious dimension, this is not just Catholic charities, this is any religious organization, its distinctly religious dimension tends to get emptied out. Why? Well, first of all, because of various interpretations of the First Amendment. That's one reason. But actually more seriously and more worryingly, I think that the people working in many of these organizations, their focus becomes less upon what is a Catholic or what is a Jewish or what is a Presbyterian or whatever vision of the person, And you start slowly to think about things like a government bureaucrat, which means you tend to adopt a cookie-cutter approach to problems, which means that you fall into the trap of thinking that just spending more money is going to solve the problem. But you also fail, I think, to do what Benedict XVI talked about in his encyclical Deus Caritas Est, which is to recognize that there are many problems that simply are not resolvable by economic aid. There are so many problems of a personal, spiritual, and moral nature that simply aren't fixable by government. And what they need is loving, personal concern. That means you personally investing a lot of time in a person that you may not like particularly much, trying to help them to beat their addiction or to help them to get a job that they can stick at rather than not stick at, etc., etc. So I think there is more awareness now than there was, say, 20, 30, or even 10 years ago about the problems associated with taking state funding by a religious organization. Now, of course, there are plenty of people working in those organizations who are doing very good work, who I think are living out the gospel, who are genuinely helping the poor, but there are also a lot of people working in these organizations who could care less about the religious character of the organization. If you want to see where this takes you in the ultimate scheme of things, go to Germany. Go to Germany, where the Catholic Church and the other Christian churches receive, via the church tax, enormous amounts of money. Does anyone think that the churches in Germany are live, vibrant, exciting organizations full of the gospel and getting out there and evangelizing the world? Does anyone believe that? The Germans themselves don't believe that, because many of these churches have, as a result of state funding, but also some obvious theological problems, have become nothing more than arms of the state. And that's not what religious organizations should be as they try to carry out their particular mission to the poor and marginalized in society. So I think more priests, more bishops, and people of other confessions are more aware of this problem. Now the question is, how do you get out of it? Because if you are so dependent upon government funding, then you need to replace it with something. And that's not so easy. And that's the other thing I say in the book, that if one wants to reduce the extent to which religious organizations are dependent upon government funding, then that means that believers have to be willing to step up to the plate when it comes to funding these organizations. So it might mean that individual believers have to give more rather than assuming that somehow, well, if they just get that government contract, they'll be able to fund their activities.
Hi. Did you find in writing this book that not only did it reveal a case to you that being a Catholic is not in conflict with supporting limited government and a free economy, but that if I'm carrying out my Catholic faith, that I am morally obligated to strive for a limited government and free economy in support of human flourishing?
Sure. That's a good question. One of the things I say right at the beginning of the book is that I'm not claiming that mine is the only possible Catholic approach to thinking about economic matters or even the role of government. What I do say is I think that what I'm presenting is based upon reflections upon the Gospels, upon Catholic social teaching, upon natural law, and then prudential application of those principles to the realm of the economy and government. Now, there are plenty of other Catholics who will say, no, these things translate into bigger government, less free economy, etc., etc. I'm prepared to say to them, okay, then we need to have a discussion and an argument about that, because I think that for many decades, the assumption was very operative, including in the United States, that somehow faithful Catholics thinking about the economy and the role of government automatically transferred into support for the New Deal. or support for the Great Society. And there are even priests like Father John A. Ryan who were very influential in the 1930s in providing a moral intellectual case from a Catholic standpoint for these things. So, am I saying that one is morally obligated to support the positions that I'm arguing for? Well, in some cases, I think yes. I don't think you can be a Catholic and a socialist. In fact, the popes are very clear about that. That's simply impossible. You also can't be a Catholic and an anarchist. That's another position. But within that spectrum, there's a lot of argument that Catholics can have among themselves and still be in good conscience and faithful to the teachings of the Church. I do think that the Catholic position in favor of limited government tends to be much stronger than a Catholic position in favor of extensive government intervention. I do think that a Catholic case for economic freedom is much stronger than a Catholic case for a social democratic type of arrangement. But that said, I think one of the things that this book tries to do is to say, no, that concerns for social justice, concerns for the common good, concerns for the option of the poor don't automatically translate into an option for big government. That's what you hear from a lot of people. Option for the poor means bigger government. I'm saying no, it doesn't. In many cases, in fact, I'd say in most cases, it certainly doesn't. But what you're really pointing to is that Catholic social teaching provides principles, but it's actually up to lay people. The Second Vatican Council was very explicit about this. That it's up to lay people to apply these principles prudentially in the public square, which actually means, by the way, that bishops should say a lot less about economic matters, because it's actually not their job to do that. It's their job to articulate the principles and for lay people to apply these principles in the public square, where there is actually, to a certain degree, some room for disagreement. There's no Catholic position that says that the size of government's share of GDP must be 10%, or it must be 8%, or it must be 20%. Those are arguments that Catholics and other people can prudentially argue about. What you can't argue, I think, is that somehow the Church's position on economic subjects somehow translates into a very big, generous, ever-expanding welfare state. You can't argue that somehow the principle of solidarity means that the government takes care of any number of problems. Jordan Baylor.
Can you say a little bit about the framing of your argument in Tea Party Catholic within the context of debates and controversies concerning the heresy of Americanism, and expand on that a little bit? Does anybody within those contexts draw on Charles Carroll? What's the relationship in terms of rivalry between Europe and the United States and the Catholic Church then and now, those sorts of things?
Okay. Americanism was a heresy that was condemned by Leo XIII. And there's still argument today about what he actually meant by Americanism. It's one of those wonderful papal encyclicals that people with who can conclude from the same encyclical completely different positions. But broadly speaking, and I'm paraphrasing now, Americanism was the idea that somehow the Church should adapt to the cultures in which it finds itself. And it was argued that there are a lot of American Catholics, including people like whoever the founder of the Paulists, that they were inclined towards this position. And of course that's problematic, because the Church is not in the business of simply adapting to whatever culture it finds itself in. The Church is in the business of transforming the cultures it encounters from within. And it does so in different ways. It doesn't mean somehow eradicating whatever was there before. It doesn't mean not dealing with the realities in which one finds oneself. But if Americanism means simply mass adaptation towards what are perceived American norms and assumptions and institutions because they are American rather than something different, then that's obviously problematic. In the context of these debates that went on in the late 19th century, Charles Carroll wasn't invoked in any of these discussions. In fact, Charles Carroll, as a historical figure, more or less disappears from most people's view not long after he died. He's just simply remembered as the last American signer to die. I have some theories about why he disappeared from public view. I think it has a lot to do with the type of histories that were obviously being written at that time. There were some people who were in fact, the argument at the time was very much about whether America was a Protestant nation or whether it was founded upon Enlightenment principles. In that discussion, Catholics didn't really get much of didn't get very much attention. But that said, the problem of Americanism, as it was described in this particular encyclical, is something that any religious organization has to be careful of, that it just doesn't adapt to what's going on around in the world around it. At the same time, that doesn't mean that the church can learn things from the cultures that it encounters. People like Augustine and Ambrose talked about plundering the treasures of the Egyptians, right? So that you take the things from the world around you and that are compatible with Christian faith, and you transform them from within. Or even some of the institutions that you encounter. There are truths that can be recognized from outside revelation, and that these things can be assimilated into or conformable to the demands of divine revelation. So there are some people, I guess you'd call them on the traditionalist side of things, who would accuse this book of being Americanist. But you find, for those of you who read the book, that it articulates particular challenges to the United States as much as it praises certain aspects of the American experiment. It says, for example, that consumerism is a real problem in the United States. I don't think that's really hard to deny. In fact, John Courtney Murray in the 1940s talked about, and this is the man who was constantly defending American ways of liberty to everyone else in the world. He said, yes, we've done these wonderful things, but we're also incredibly materialistic and selfish. So he's a very good example, I think, of someone who's simultaneously engaging and affirming aspects of the culture in which he's finding himself, but he's also willing to be critical as well. And that, I think, is the role that any Christian confession should be in any sort of society in which it finds itself. Sometimes the praise of the society will outweigh the criticism. Sometimes the criticism will outweigh the praise. That depends on what stage the society is at and what type of transition it's going through.
Okay, we have time for one quick question. Here we go.
A couple comments. First, one, liberals are very charitable. They're just charitable with other people's money. And Margaret Thatcher made the comment that the problem with socialism is eventually socialists run out of other people's money to be charitable with. Do you see any model that allows the private sector charities to take on the social roles that liberals want to do with with government resources?
Well, to tell you the truth, I don't think that deep down a lot of secularists are that interested in. Deep down, I think a lot of secularists aren't actually that interested in helping people flourish in the way that I've described it. I think in many respects, the vision of the human person that's operative in their models is of a highly hedonistic, hyper-individualist, who exists essentially to satisfy their desires, and the government exists to satisfy their desires as well. You just need to watch the thing, I think it was put out by, it's called The Life of Julia. Have many of you seen this particular video? It's worth watching because it's a vision of how some people view the role of individuals in government. Just Google Life of Julia, it'll come up. And it's about a fictional character who is assisted at every single stage of her life by the government. She has children. There's no evidence of a husband. She's constantly being given things by the state. And I think that's pretty much, in a cartoon-like way, a way that many secularists think about the role of the state and the way they conceptualize human needs and desires. But going back in American history, there are, of course, plenty of alternative models that Christians and other people of faith can embrace and promote, which I think have enormous potential for dealing with some of the problems of poverty, both material poverty but also moral and spiritual poverty that we see all around us. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1830s, he immediately noticed that when there was a problem in a given community, Americans didn't look to the government, either state or federal, to solve the problem. They banded together, usually, by the way, in religious associations, and took care of the problem themselves. And then they stepped back when the problem was taken care of. Before the advent of the welfare state, both in the United States and in Europe, there were enormous numbers of associations, of organizations, most of which were more or less religious in their foundation or origin or inspiration, that took care of many of these particular problems. And it's with the advent of the welfare state that these organizations essentially either got crowded out of the business of helping people, or in some respects became mere auxiliaries of Leviathan, so to speak. So there's plenty of examples. Now the problem is, of course, is that in our very rational, technologically minded world, we say, well, that's not efficient. Maybe we just need a bigger, better, top-down approach to dealing with these problems. Well, guess what? That's called the welfare state. And it hasn't worked very well. In fact, in my book, Becoming Europe, I think I mentioned this in Tea Party Catholic as well, poverty rates in the United States essentially stopped dropping around about 1970, 1971, 1972. And all those great society programs that were introduced by Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, they don't really seem to have solved the problem. Indeed, and again I mentioned this in Tea Party Catholic, plenty of Americans, not just conservatives by the way, but also a good number of liberals, have commented upon how the welfare state has done such damage to many segments of American society that are among the most marginalized, and segments of society that were, in many respects, rising out of poverty just when the Great Society program started to be implemented. So whenever I hear people say, well, no, we need the state to take care of these. Well, we've been trying that since Bismarck's time, and it hasn't really worked. Thank you.
Join me in thanking Sam for a wonderful talk today.